Good morning. We're going to be in Mark's Gospel this morning, chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 23. We're going to go all the way down through chapter 3, verse 7. Now, I want to start this morning by asking you a question. This is an important question, so I want you to really think and consider before you answer. Does toilet paper, which these days is white gold, is toilet paper, when you hang it, is it supposed to go over the roll like that or under the roll? Now, every self-respecting believer in Jesus knows the answer to this is it goes under the roll. Not over, under. If you're putting it over, you're wrong. Please change. Now, I know that some of you out there right now are getting ready to write comments and they're telling me how wrong I am. But here's my real question. Is this an issue worth arguing about? Okay, probably a bad example because yes, it is. It goes under the roll. Come on, people. There are lots of things that we have in life, lots of things we love to debate about, argue about, that really, when you look at it, is this an important thing to argue about? Can we just let it go? These two stories that we're going to look at today, Jesus is in two different arguments. And with both of them, they almost seem to be something that you could just let go and not bother arguing. But Jesus does. Jesus argues these points. And in fact, in one of these stories, Jesus starts the argument. Why? Why were these things that don't seem that important, don't seem important enough to fight about, why was Jesus willing to fight about them? So let's pick up the story. We're going to be in verse 23 of Mark chapter 2 to start. And it says there, one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. And as his disciples walked along, they began plucking some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Now, notice the Pharisees are watching them as they're just walking through a field. These guys are waiting for them to make a mistake and do something wrong. You shouldn't be picking these heads of grain. Now, here's the thing. It's not that they were stealing, because they weren't stealing. In Jewish law, you were allowed to do something called gleaning. That meant if you're walking through some guy's apple orchard, you're allowed to take an apple off the tree and eat it. You're not allowed to go through there with a basket and gather a whole bunch of them, but you're allowed to just take something and eat it as you go. Nobody had a problem with that. So why were the Pharisees upset with the disciples because they were gleaning? Well, they were doing it on the Sabbath. Are you not allowed to glean on the Sabbath? No, you could. You could. See, here's the problem. They were plucking these heads of grain, and they were taking the grain and they were rubbing it in their hands like this, and then they were blowing it, because that would separate the chaff from the part that you could actually eat. They were harvesting and winnowing on the Sabbath. Like any farmer is going to harvest his crop like that, go through the field all day doing that. These guys were just snacking. But the Pharisees were looking for something to argue about. Look at Jesus' defense. Because you would think that the best way to solve this problem would be to roll your eyes and ignore it and not engage with knuckleheads at that level. But Jesus does. He argues in verse 25, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." His argument was, hey, when David had nothing to eat, he ate this consecrated bread that was only for the priests. It'd be the equivalent of if you walked into church this morning and said, hey, I didn't get anything to eat. Let me grab some of all this communion bread and I'll just snack on that. But David did that. And what was his punishment? Nothing. God understood. So Jesus is saying, hey, we shouldn't be punished for this. God understands. But again, it seems like such a minor thing. The Pharisees are down at this level, and when somebody's down at this level, you really should just ignore them. Not only doesn't Jesus ignore them, but look at the next story, because Jesus takes it to a whole different level, and it's Jesus who starts the fight here when he didn't have to. Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger, and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. It's a Sabbath. You're not allowed to heal on the Sabbath. Okay, we get that. And this man is sitting there. He's got a withered hand. He's crippled in his hand. And he's not there to be healed. He didn't ask Jesus to heal him. He's just there because it's the Sabbath and he's there to worship. The Pharisees are there. This man's life is not in danger. If he doesn't get his hand healed right then, he's going to live. He could easily have come back the next day. Jesus easily could have said to the guy, "Listen, tomorrow meet me here. I'll get you all healed up." Can't do it right now because it's the Sabbath. This wasn't something that had to be done, but Jesus picks a fight. He says, which is better to do? On this day that we're here to honor God, is it better to see God's glory through me healing this guy or to let him continue to suffer? Well, obviously it's better to see God's glory, but our question again is, Jesus, did you really need to pick this fight? It wasn't a life and death matter. All right, so why was Jesus doing all this? Why use up your good graces on these minor issues? It's not a question of was Jesus right? Of course Jesus was right. On both of these issues, Jesus was right. But just like I'm right about how toilet paper should be hung, is it worth fighting about? Is it worth alienating people? So why did Jesus do that? Well, there's a bigger agenda going on here. Jesus wanted to use the power of God, the glory of God, to heal this man, to bring honor to God. But the system that they had in place really frowned on that. Hang on a second. Your system frowns on something that would bring God glory. Now, what's interesting in verse 5, it says he looked around at them in anger. And that word there for anger actually means sadness. Not so much anger, but sadness. Jesus' heart was broken. It hurt him to see these religious leaders. These were guys who should have been teaching people about God, who should have been introducing them to the concept of God's glory and looking for God's glory wherever they could. That's how they should have been leading the people. How were they leading the people? Here's a whole set of rules and regulations, and you have to obey them. See, right there you have the difference between faith and religion. Faith says God is awesome. I want to know more about him. I want to grow in him. I want to serve him. Religion says you're not supposed to do that way. Here's all the rules. You're not supposed to break them. I remember sitting in a church years and years ago, and we were listening to this preacher, and this preacher was talking about how you should never, ever, ever shop on a Sunday. It's God's day, you shouldn't be shopping. And I'm nudging my wife going, are you listening to this man? He's a prophet of God. And he said, you probably shouldn't even shop on stores that are open on Sunday. Again, I lean over to my wife and I whisper, I said, preach it, brother, amen. And then he said, and in fact, you shouldn't even watch football on Sunday. And that's when I leaned over to my wife and said, get your things, we're leaving. He had a whole bunch of rules and regulations. It's so easy for people who are seeking God to run up against this. Here's all the rules, here's all the regulations. You know what you really need? You know what God is really looking for? Do you have a heart that seeks Him? Do you have a heart that loves Him? Jesus had a heart that loved this guy with the withered hand and understood, you know what? Let's give God glory. I don't care about the petty little rules and regulations and what we're going to be breaking. Let's give God glory. Let's not worry about things like plucking grain on the Sabbath. Come on, we're better than that. Let's look for ways that we can glorify God. So here's what we need to get from this. Again, this all applies to what we're going through right now with the quarantine, with the situation in the world. There's going to be all kinds of people in need. Let's look for ways that we can help them. Let's not find reasons that we can't. Let's not find reasons that we say no. Sometimes with some things we have to say no. But as often as we possibly can, let's say yes. You see, it's the people who are looking for ways to say yes. They're the ones who have the heart that are seeking for God's glory. Be one of those people. Look for ways to say yes. And most importantly, stay positive. We're going to pick up our study on Mark's Gospel on Monday. Have a great weekend. We will see you on Sunday morning for the live stream. Happy Easter. God bless you. Take care.